Yeah, so my name's April. I'm one of the clinicians here at OCD North, and accompanied with me is Marissa. Marissa is the founder, owner, and also a clinician at OCD North. And if for anyone who's not aware, at OCD North, we pride ourselves in specializing in OCD and ERP treatment, so the exposure and response prevention treatment. That's the gold standard treatment for helping those who are faced with OCD. And so what we are hoping to do is offer this Q&A for any of the clinicians or other type of treatment professionals that are helping people that might have OCD or come across them that have OCD. So we really want to offer any type of education and opportunity to provide that support. So we don't only want to support our clients that come to us, but also any professionals that are supporting clients that also have OCD as well.
We received a few questions from some interested attendees that we have in a document next to us. So we'll work our way through these questions. If any other questions come up as we're going through our Q&A, please feel free to type them in the chat bar. I believe there's a Q&A function on Zoom itself. So April and I will keep an eye on the Q&A as well as the chat and get to any questions that you have. If at the end of the webinar today at 12:30 we still haven't answered your question, we can be reached at info@ocdnorth.com for any other questions. We love this stuff. We live and breathe OCD and love talking about it. So if you're interested, if you want to know more, email us. We're happy to share all of our information. So why don't we get started? Okay. This first question is pretty general, and it's something that I'm laughing because I ask myself this every time I see a new person. How do I know if my client has OCD? For us, it's pretty easy because we're OCD North. That said, for those of you that aren't trained in exposure and response prevention and don't know what to look for with respect to OCD, it can be a little bit insidious and difficult to suss out. So the difference between OCD and any other type of anxiety disorder is the function of the behavior or the compulsion, as well as the nature of the obsession. What I mean by that is the obsession is that ruminative thinking. And if your client is expressing a lot of what if thoughts, followed by something that is completely illogical, doesn't really make sense, it could be OCD. Whereas, the difference with an anxiety disorder is that your client with an anxiety disorder or even phobia would be expressing concerns over real world events. For example, I'm anxious about my test coming up. I'm anxious about what else? The going to school tomorrow. I'm nervous about seeing my parents for the first time in years. I'm nervous about, I'm anxious about, I'm worried about. If the last part of that sentence is followed by real world concerns or real life imminent concerns, it's likely anxiety and not OCD. However, if your client sitting in front of you is saying, what if I lock my cat in the washer? Could be OCD. What if I get in my car and I run off the road? What if I have an impulse and run my car off the road? That's something that we need to be considering as OCD. So you're really looking for the what if thoughts, any what if dialogue. You're looking for any sort of behavior that helps to calm that anxiety. So one way we can suss this out is, so your client says, what if I have an urge and run my car off the road? Your follow-up question to that could be something to the effect of, what do you do to make that thought go away? Here we're identifying the compulsion. So your client might say, well, I turn up the radio really loud and I sing to make sure that I'm present and in the moment. Or I tell myself that it's going to be okay, I'm going to be okay, I'm going to be okay. A mental ritual. So the function of the compulsion always eases the intrusive thought. What am I missing, April?
I think you hit everything. Yeah, no, I don't think there's really anything missed there. If anyone has any further questions about what Marissa shared, again, certainly share it in the chat or the Q&A. But yeah, I think you hit everything, all the important points.
Excellent.
Yeah, so if there's no questions for that, then I can move on to the other question that we have here. And it's another kind of general question, but a very important one. And it's, I think my client has OCD. What now? What should I be doing? And so when it comes to OCD and OCD treatment, the really important thing that we want to know is that core fear. What is it that's driving the OCD? Because when we have this core fear and OCD's, presenting for us, we're often doing everything we possibly can to ensure that core fear doesn't happen. And that's where those compulsions are coming in, right? Anything that's going to allow us to feel like we have control, or allow us to feel like there's some certainty in our life, and feel like that fear isn't going to happen. So we really want to learn, what is that core fear that's driving it for us? What are those obsessions all around? What the compulsions we're engaging in to allow for that short-term relief? And when we realize and find out what this core fear is through our assessment process, often using what we call the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, and also with self-monitoring tools that we provide each client throughout the assessment process, we really learn what that core fear is. And when we have this core fear and we have the triggers that are, bringing forward this fear, we then develop, this hierarchy of exposures, right? So when it comes to exposure and prevention therapy, we really want to look at exposing people to that core fear and that all those triggers that are happening. So when we're putting ourselves into those triggering moments and experiencing that fear that comes up for us, we're just sitting in that distress and allowing it to come down on its own without engaging in those compulsions. So really developing a hierarchy of a whole bunch of different exposures that we can engage in, and then rating how distressing each exposure would be. And that's where that hierarchy really plays a role. So, we use what's called a subjective units of distress, which is, that fancy way of saying how distressed are you on a scale of 0 to 10 or 0 to 100. And we rate each exposure that we came up with to see, where can we start? And we really want to make sure that we're starting somewhere that, is a good middle ground, where we're experiencing some distress, that we can see how this type of therapy works, but not so much that they're not going to come back to us and continue treatment. So I often find, and I don't know if Marissa agrees, that, between a 4 and a 6, people are often feeling good to kind of start with as their exposure. And then, also a big piece is encouraging that connection with the other supports in the individual's life. So if they have a family physician or any other supports that are helping them, then encouraging them to connect with them, to allow for that a whole support system when it comes to the exposure and response prevention therapy, and just supporting the individual who's experiencing the OCD. And also we are offering this Q&A to ensure we're answering any questions people have, to make sure that clients are well supported and all those answers are provided. But there's always the option to connect with us at OCD North for just further questions or support around how that assessment happens and anything like that. So when it comes down to, you think your client has OCD, what now? I think, all the information I provided, but again, we're always here to offer any type of support, any questions that you have as well.
Question came in. I'm going to hit the answer live button here. Do you have any strategies and techniques for someone who may show OCD behaviors or compulsions, but may have difficulty communicating the fear, etc.? nonverbal, etc. So this is a really great question, and I have someone in my on my caseload right now who is nonverbal. And what's difficult about nonverbal is that they can't really consent to treatment, right? So I typically work with family members, and I consult with community members, other members of the treatment team, to make sure that if there are OCD behaviors or compulsions, we're substituting those behaviors. We're not taking them away. We don't want an adversive response to the fear. We want to substitute the behavior with something that's rewarding, that will also take the distress away, because we have to remember that OCD behaviors or compulsions, they exist because there's anxiety or there's fear. So if we take away a coping mechanism, we have to substitute that coping mechanism with something equally as effective. But the one thing we want to be sure of is that the person consents to us doing this. Otherwise, we get into a whole ethical dilemma, and that's something that we want to avoid. I hope that answered your question. Our next question here: do we complete exposures in session together, or do I assign them as homework? Both. Done. So what's different, I have 4 rules for exposures, and this transcends all types of clients, all types of subgroups. My 4 rules are that I will never ask you to do something that I myself am not willing to do. So that is because if I can do it, then you can do it, and we can show OCD that you can do it. And if I'm doing it, then it mustn't be that scary. So we're really showing OCD that if I'm able to do something, then it's really not as scary as OCD wants us to think it is. So there's that rule. I will never ask you to do something that I don't think that you're ready for. And you will always have control over which exposures we do in session and when. So, I mean, my job is to provoke anxiety. My job is to make sure that we're working to help you recover from OCD. So I'm really good at eliciting the anxiety, but I'm also really good at asking permission first. So if you say, no, Marissa, I'm really not ready for that, then we won't go there. But I will encourage you to approach the tough stuff. The 4th exposure is, did I mention whatever we do together? Okay, so the last rule then is whatever we do in session, you have to do outside of session. It's incredibly important, because we can't just face fear once, right? I mean, if we are afraid of heights and we climb a ladder once every 10 years, are we really over the fear of heights? No. We have to climb that ladder up and down 10 times a day until heights are no longer bothersome. So we have to make the learning generalizable across all different situations and all different contexts. And doing an exposure in session once, twice, 3 times is a step in the right direction. But the real test, the real learning happens when you do it on your own multiple times throughout treatment.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. So another question we had was, what is an imaginal exposure? So I think that's a really great question. I think imaginal exposures definitely don't receive as much attention as the in vivo exposures do. I think, you know, in treatment, it's very important to do those in vivo exposures where we're having that, you know, in-person contact and, you know, engaging in those physical exposures. But there's also a really important role when it comes to imaginals, because with OCD, it comes up in every aspect you can possibly imagine when it comes to things that you can fear. And that being said, there's certain things that we can fear that we aren't able to expose ourselves to, whether it just being socially inappropriate or illegal, or anything like that. So the imaginals really allow us. Pardon?
Or impossible.
Yes,
like
that too.
Oriented obsessions.
Yeah. So we really want to be able to still, you know, conquer that fear and find ways to lean into that fear while also ensuring that we're, you know, following all the rules and the law and, you know, doing everything that we can. So when it comes to imaginals, things, you know, for example, if it comes to our fears to harm someone else, we can come as close as the objects that we're worried we're going to harm them with through in vivo, but we can't actually harm them. So what we would do is we'd allow for an imaginal exposure. So the imaginal exposures is essentially where we would have the individual sitting down and walking us through what that fear is and what the ultimate outcome if we weren't to engage in our compulsion. So if, you know, if the fear was that we were going to harm a loved one, we would then sit there and have the client tell us, you know, from start to finish, if I didn't engage in a compulsion when I walked past the knife, what is then going to happen? And they're sharing their story with us and that fear with us, and we're essentially writing out exactly what they're saying in that experience. And what we would do together is then read the story that they've come up with, or that experience that they've come up with where they didn't have any compulsions and that core fear ended up happening. And you know, it goes as far as OCD wants them to go. Some people will essentially, you know, end at being alone or being in jail, but it could even go past to, you know, an afterlife if that's where OCD wants to take them. So we really want to allow them to go wherever OCD is going to go for them. And as they're doing that, we're writing out all of this and then we're reading it out together. So the client will read it out, I will then read it out, and then we'll also want to record each other reading it. And then as homework, the client would then want to listen to that recording over and over again. So what we're doing is we're allowing our mind to actually go there, to actually go to that fear happening instead of doing compulsions to stop that thought from ever even getting to the core fear. And so we're essentially living it out through the imaginal and replaying it consistently as we would for an in vivo exposure, to really sit with that distress and sit with that core fear truly happening, and allowing that distress to come down naturally each time we listen to it. Do you think I missed anything there, Marissa?
No, not at all. I love imaginal exposures. It's basically a terror script, right?
Yeah.
And we do them a lot for future oriented concerns, for things that are illegal or just not testable in real life. I mean, OCD is all about uncertainty. And so sometimes the uncertainty is literally so uncertain that there's no way we could do an in vivo exposure, and the imaginal exposure really comes in handy. And the research demonstrates that imaginal exposure should be part of treatment. So our next question here is, how do I know if we are doing the exposure right? If you're seeing some distress and an urge to ritualize, you're doing the exposure right. So it'll feel, we always tell our clients that this is a very counterintuitive approach to treatment. We want to lean into the fear and face it. And if we're doing the exposure right, we get those feared, the anxiety reactions. You might see some physiological reactions with your clients, sweat, nervousness, shaking, any of those, or any typical normal anxiety reactions. You're doing your job right. Any urge to ritualize, you're doing your job right. And lastly, if the exposure is mapped out correctly, if you and your client have laid out exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, we don't tell them what to expect because that kind of spoils the exposure. But if at the end of the exposure, they're like, oh, my cat didn't go into the washer. Weird. I didn't even close the door. Then if there's new learning at the end of the exposure, if the worst fear didn't come true, even though they didn't perform compulsions, you did the exposure right. So pat on the back there. What am I missing, April?
Um, I think that's pretty much it. I do know that there are times, I think that the anxiety plays a huge role on, where we are in that exposure. But I
Mhm.
think there's also those times where we can do an exposure and we don't always have that distress that we're looking for in order to gauge and if it was, done right and correct. And I think oftentimes that's either because we're present and we kind of scare OCD a little bit more for the individual. So prepping them for, well, what would this be like if we weren't here, and how we would do that exposure, and essentially just running through that and teaching them how to do that exposure, knowing that when they go and do it on their own as homework, there might be some more distress than maybe the base level stress that they had with us, and also knowing the future, um, the future worries that, well, I'm doing this now, but I'm not worried it's going to happen now. I'm worried it's going to happen in a couple of hours. So things like that, where there's some anticipatory distress coming, and that allows for whether there's maybe a follow-up call later to check in and seeing how the exposure had panned out, and knowing that we're there to be a support when that distress does come forward to ensure those compulsions aren't happening, and we're sitting in that distress naturally as well. So I think that just kind of goes off of what Marissa was saying as well.
The other component of that is, April, you were saying that if we don't elicit anxiety, you offered one possibility. The other possibility is that they are completely surprised that the exposure didn't elicit anxiety.
Mhm.
And so that provides an opportunity in and of itself to do some immediate processing. And tell me about that. Why was it that you were able to do this without performing any compulsions? And why are you surprised? So sometimes not experiencing anxiety or distress also provides for that new learning. And
Mhm.
frankly, I love those sessions just as much because it's a good indicator.
Mhm.
Absolutely. People can do hard things. They just sometimes need a push or a shove in the right direction.
Yeah, I think a common denominator with the treatment is that the thoughts are much scarier than the action. So I love, like Marissa was sharing, just seeing that reaction, seeing that learning happening with the clients is amazing and awesome.
Yeah, it is.
hmm So it looks like we have run through all the questions we have. Does anyone else have any other questions for us?
We'll give everybody a second to type in the Q&A or chat. And in the meantime, maybe we can um, do some wrap up and final thoughts. Um, I love treating OCD. I love talking about OCD. And this is something that I've been looking forward to for weeks. So I'm glad that we had an opportunity to do it today.
hmm Oh, there's a question here. Will you be offering some information-based webinars to learn more? Um, yeah, so Marissa and we're always looking for new ways to teach people about OCD and exposure and response prevention therapy. So webinars are certainly something that we're working on. Um, and in looking at different types of webinars that we can do, whether it's body focused repetitive behavior or OCD specific. We're definitely looking at having some webinars available. And is there any webinars that anyone's super interested in learning specifically about? Any topics?
We're always looking for content. So while everybody or anyone answers that, we're working, some of our ideas include, like April said, kind of an OCD 101, what every clinician should know, what every physician should know. There's a really big knowledge gap when it comes to, yeah, great. So OCD 101 is coming. Follow us on social, and we love OCD 101. So that's coming. Exposure and response prevention. What else? Body focused repetitive behaviors. You mentioned, April. Body dysmorphic disorder. Pediatric OCD is a big one, near and dear to our hearts. Family accommodation. and supporting family members that have OCD. So all of those are sort of in the queue, and we will certainly work to get them out. We are hosting another webinar next Friday. Our social work student from the University of Toronto is spearheading that, and it's called Supporting Your Child with OCD. Registration for that is on our website. Any final thoughts from you, April?
No, I think that's about it. Just that, like I said, we're looking to share our knowledge about OCD and exposure and response prevention. So I'm hoping to have another Q&A in the future for anyone that's interested, and yeah, any questions around a client that's coming up in regards to just exposure ideas or learning more about ERP. We're always here, like I shared, and like I said, hopefully in the future we'll have another Q&A option.
We do offer consultation opportunities for professionals. That service is not yet listed on our website, but that's something that's in the works now. So lots of support here. And we're ending right on time. How rare is that?
Perfect. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been lovely just kind of answering the questions that you had and chatting, and yeah.
We'll talk to you again soon. Keep an eye on our socials for more events, more free webinars, more learning opportunities. Bye, everyone.